Hello everyone, and welcome to the Henchman's Memoirs. This week we are once again talking about Daggerheart, and specifically we are going to be talking about some lessons learned from the games that inspired Daggerheart, like Blades in the Dark and Dungeon World, and other games that sort of spun out of the original Apocalypse World game that was so influential and had so many sort of hacks and imitators. These are all things that you can bring from those games into your Daggerheart game without any kind of house rules or anything like that. It's just taking some of the best practices that the communities of those games developed and kind of bringing them right into your Daggerheart game to sort of level up your GMing. So the first one we're going to talk about is a move called Offer Them a Worse Outcome. This is a really humble sounding move, but it spawned an entire sort of cottage industry of creating custom moves for different situations in Dungeon World. So let's talk about how it worked over there first. In Dungeon World, there were three outcomes. There was a full success, there was success with a consequence, and then there was failure, which was all consequence. So let's say you came across this giant door that led to this abandoned dwarven citadel, right? And they called it a mine. And to get through this door, you were going to need to decipher all of these runes that are on it, and there's this very complex locking mechanism that you have to figure out and work through. So in Dungeon World, or Freebooters on the Frontier, you would say, to open this thing up, you're going to roll, basically it would be like a knowledge roll in Daggerheart. If you got a full success, you opened it up, no problem. If you got a success with a consequence, you would have to choose, the players get to choose the consequence that they're going to suffer from a list. So it might be, you can choose either it takes a lot longer than you had hoped, and the GM gets an extra roll for random encounters, or it's particularly challenging and taxing, and whoever's doing the roll has to mark 2 stress. Or in order to finally get it open, you actually have to break part of the mechanism, so it's going to be obvious to anyone who comes by that you went this way. Right, and the players getting to choose that consequence is one of the things that made it so interesting, because that's going to affect the story going forward. The other advantage of this was that you could say on a failure, let's say the adventure is on the other side of this door and the party needs to get through it, right? So on a failure, you could say they have to pick 2 of those consequences, or even maybe that all 3 of those consequences happen to them. And all kinds of Dungeon World and Freebooters adventures would have custom moves in them that created sort of player choice, which is, according to the Hench Son, that is the juice of a good role-playing game scene, is the players having meaningful choices. I'm going to try to include a link to a article talking about how to write your own custom moves for Dungeon World. You can see how you can bring it over into Daggerheart. So all we're going to do to bring this kind of thing over and get started is we're going to use these location stat blocks, right? And we're going to create a feature in the location, and we're basically going to say, if you're trying to open this door, if you roll success with hope, then you open the door, no problem. If you roll a success with a fear, the GM is going to immediately turn around and spend that fear so that you have to choose one of the consequences. If you roll a failure with hope, the DM is going to give you the opportunity to spend that hope right back and succeed, but take a consequence. And then, of course, if you fail with fear, we're just going to hit you with multiple consequences that maybe you do or don't get to choose which ones you're taking. So let's come up with another example of this just to show you how cool this can be and how it works. Let's take the Outpost Town stat block, and let's say the party gets here and they're freebooters and they're looking for a lead to a nearby dungeon that they can go and rob for treasure. And so they're going to roll something like plus presence, right? They're going to make a presence ability check, and you're going to set the DC at 14. If they succeed with hope, then they get a good lead on a nearby dungeon that they can go to and continue adventuring. If they succeed with fear or fail with hope, you're going to ask them to choose from the following list. Either they get a lead, but there's a group of adventurers that just came through 3 days before and got the same information, and so they're already ahead of the party headed to the dungeon. Or the party can choose that there's conflicting rumors about where the entrance to the dungeon is, and so the party kind of has to pick which direction they're going to go first. Or you could say they choose that the local mayor or the local vicar gets wind that they're planning to head out to the Caves of Chaos, and maybe he gets together a posse to stop them because he doesn't want them stirring up trouble. And then, of course, again, if they roll a failure with fear, they're going to have to choose 2 of those consequences. And you can see already how this is really going to change what happens in the adventure. It's going to make each playthrough of your travel to the Caves of Chaos, assuming they don't just roll a success with hope, it's going to add several encounters and a whole new storyline to that. So you can look around online and start to see the custom moves that people created for games like Dungeon World, and you're going to find out pretty quick, it is so much fun to kind of create these things and add this to your game. All right, so the next thing we're going to take specifically from Dungeon World is escalating GM moves. So they don't give nearly enough advice about how to use hard moves and soft moves when you are the GM of a game like Daggerheart. So we're going to bring that advice in from other games that have already kind of walked this path. The thing is, hard moves and soft moves. So when a player rolls with fear and you get a fear point, right? How you spend this fear point can have drastically different impact on the scene. For example, if they fail their roll, then the spotlight comes to you, and you're probably going to spotlight an adversary because that's the flow of the scene, right? Somebody in the party gets to go, maybe 2 people in the party get to go, then a couple of the monsters get to go, or one of the monsters get to go, and then the spotlight goes back to them, and it kind of goes back and forth. That's kind of what we expect from a game like 5th edition, for example. So when you're first starting out at GMing, when you get a fear, you might also just spend that so you get to spotlight an extra adversary before the players get a chance to respond. You get to get 2 turns before they get a chance to go. Well, that's fine. The thing to realize, though, is that's a pretty high impact way to spend a fear. When you consider you could also spend that fear to just add 1 monster's experience to his attack. So it's the difference between adding 2 or 3 to an attack versus getting a whole nother attack and possible damage roll. So this is the difference between hard moves and soft moves. Other soft move examples can be like signaling that there's an off-screen threat, right? You can spend a fear just to start a countdown clock that reinforcements are coming, okay? You can spend a fear to maybe trigger a location's fear move or an adversary's fear move. And depending on what those fear moves are, that can be a relatively hard or a relatively soft move. By the same token, you can spend a fear just to have more reinforcements show up. You can spend a fear. The granddaddy of them all is reveal an unwelcome truth or unexpected danger. If you spend a single fear to reveal an unwelcome truth, depending on what that unwelcome truth is, that can be a very hard move. Like I say, that can be reinforcements. That can be that the boss has a second stage and gets a whole bunch of new powers. That can be that one of the hobgoblins is actually a hobgoblin witch doctor, and now he's going to start casting spells that affect the whole battleground. So the point of this is, once you get a handle on the scope of soft moves to hard moves, you can start escalating the moves as the scene goes on. This is what you do in Dungeon World The first couple times that they roll with fear, I'm going to spend these fear on relatively low impact moves, like starting a timer or maybe making them mark a point of stress, making one of the players mark a point of stress, or possibly using one of their fear moves if they're not too bad, right? But then as the encounter goes on, every time the players roll with fear, I'm going to spend those on progressively harder and harder moves and make the stakes progressively go up. This is what you want out of a combat scene, and this is what sometimes 5e failed to deliver, because somewhere around halfway through the fight, and a lot of times in 5e, you realize it's a foregone conclusion who's going to win this fight. Now we're just kind of doing bookkeeping to see how many resources we spend. But in Daggerheart, you can continue to up the stakes right up until the last scene, just like you would see in a novel or a movie. And the way you do that is by making harder and harder moves against the players as the scene progresses. But it also allows you to dial back the difficulty a little bit. Let's say the party gets in a situation and they're rolling garbage and you roll a couple of crits, and all of a sudden you're like, should I just stop spending fear in this scene to give the party a chance to survive? I would say generally no, because if you suddenly stop spending fear, the players are going to realize that you're bailing them out. And when they feel like you're going to bail them out when they're in over their heads, that can totally evaporate the stakes for the whole rest of the campaign. Just don't escalate your fear spends as quickly. Stay in the, adding a fear ability or maybe adding somebody's experience, adding an adversary's experience. Stay in that zone a little bit longer if the party is having a hard time. You can also one of the cool things about marking a clock early in the fight that there's reinforcements coming is you choose what the reinforcements are when they show up 3 or 4 or 5 exchanges later, right? It could be a couple other vampire bats, or it could just be a couple of wolves or even a warg, right? So you can decide when that timer runs out, look at the kind of situation in the fight and decide how hard you want that outcome to be. So the last thing I would say, there's some advice in here about how many fear you should spend for different encounters. I think really what you want to do is you want to spend the same amount of fear as you're earning it. You want to spend it. It's just in these incidental and minor encounters, you can even spend, if it's a chase across the rooftops to catch an informant that they're going to catch and question, you can spend fear generated to show how the world reacts, right? Maybe they knock over the tomato vendor's stall and he's like, curse you, Vox Machina! You can spend a fear on that in a minor encounter. When you get to these climactic encounters, the GM should come out swinging. Go ahead and be inflicting hard GM moves every time you're spending a fear. Monsters are showing up. More ogres are pouring into the room to make things difficult for the players. And that's how you make a really dramatic, climactic encounter. All right, so number 3, put someone in a tough spot. I used to love doing this in Freebooters on the Frontier and any Powered by the Apocalypse game. So the reason you want to put people in a spot is because it flows from the fiction. Any fiction that you're thinking of, any cartoon or novel or movie where there's a group of heroes, you're going to have the scene where somebody's put in a tough spot and the camera cuts to somebody else who tries to come to their aid. I think of the first Conan movie where they're escaping from the Temple of the Serpent and Conan is distracted by this sort of symbol of the bad guys. And the snake gets up behind him and kind of has him and is curled around him. And Subutai comes back in and shoots a couple arrows at it and gives Conan a chance to get free. And then he throws Conan a sword and Conan finishes it off. Those are the kind of scenes we're looking for. And if you start watching for them in things like The Legend of Vox Machina or whatever, you're going to see them more and more. They're even in the Hobbit cartoon where they obviously edited it to have different commercial breaks. And so before the commercial break, you'll see they zoom in on somebody who's in a tough spot. So the first time you do this, you're going to kind of get your players used to how this is going to work in the campaign. And if you can pull it off, it can be something that you can go back to again and again. So here's how you're going to do it. First of all, you're going to put somebody in a tough spot when they fail with fear. So you're going to have, in order to do this, you're going to have a monster with an ability, something like the envelop action of the huge green ooze, where somebody fails with fear. You're going to hold that fear in your hand. You're going to roll the attack against them. If the attack hits, you're going to spend that fear right away to put some kind of condition on them. A lot of these have the terms of the condition, if you will, right here in the stat block. There's only a couple conditions that are explained in the main rules, but as far as being disarmed or knocked down or pinned or picked up and about to be swallowed by the dragon, those are all things that are left to be described in the fiction, which is awesome. So you attack the player. If you hit, you spend the fear to describe them being put in a spot. Maybe the zombie Hulk knocks them down and their sword is just out of reach, and this thing has got its foot on their chest and it's picking up an anvil to like smash them with. And then it's time for the spotlight to go back to the party. You're just going to say, it looks like Gotrek is in a real spot. Does anybody want to jump in? Does anybody want to jump in is you sort of teeing up. Somebody is in a tough spot. Somebody else has a chance to jump in and help them. Now, when you say this, Gotrek's player might rightly want to take the spotlight right here and say, well, can I just get out from underneath this thing's foot? What you want to say in that moment is, yes, but this is a really high stakes role. I was wondering if somebody wanted to jump in and keep you from having to make that roll at all. So what you're describing is a situation where they're vulnerable, right? The vulnerable condition is on them. They're disarmed and they're prone. They can do something. This is really cool here. You make it so that when you put them in a spot, they take stress, but then every action they want to take after that, they have to mark a point of stress just to take an action. Right? It's the same thing with the Kraken when it describes you being drowning. Every action you want to take, you have to spend a stress for. So, yes, you can. You can spend a stress, and yes, somebody could just use the aid action to give you advantage. I wanted to see if somebody wanted to jump in to keep you from having to make that roll at all. The only thing you need to sort of be careful about in the rules for this, the way the rules for Daggerheart are, technically, if Esmeralda tries to jump in and sort of knock the anvil out of his hand, and she fails or rolls with fear, then technically the spotlight comes back to me and I'm just going to smush him. He's not going to get a reaction roll or a chance to escape. So you need to assure your players, yes, Gotrek is going to get a chance to make his reaction roll or try to make a move to escape, spend a stress, and try to get out of there. You're just teeing up an opportunity for somebody to jump in and do an action instead. Like I say, this is just something to try with your players because it really fits the fiction that we are drawing from for these kind of campaigns. It makes the fight more interesting and dynamic. It keeps everybody from feeling like they're in their own separate fight. It's kind of like Silvery Barbs was in 5th edition, where I'm watching everybody else's turn and sort of being involved in their fight. And the other great thing about it is, in the fiction, it creates character opportunities where the player can be like, they help Gotrek out and they're like, that's 3 you owe me, Gotrek, and somebody else says, actually the score is 6-2, but who's counting, something like that. And or you can have the situation where in the sort of scene between fight scenes, it's like, hey, thanks for helping me out there against the zombie Hulk. It can create all kinds of cool dynamics if you put somebody in a spot. Okay, so number 4 is tell them the requirements and ask. I personally have a very soft spot in my heart for how cool this move can be. Again, has a very unpresupposing name, but it can be a really cool way to add narrative tension to a scene in your game. So This got started in the Dungeon World forums at one point. Somebody was talking about the fact that in Dungeon World, a dragon only had like 16 hit points. And they were asking, how am I supposed to make a fight with a dragon huge and epic and back and forth if it can basically be killed in 2 hits? These aren't Daggerheart hit points. These are old school D&D hit points, right? This thing could be killed in 2 hits. So the answer was people started talking on the forums about the whole 16 hit point dragon problem. And the answer was, I'll try to put a link in the description. The party really has to make so many moves and do so many things to get into position to fight this thing. That's really where the tension and excitement is. Think about, again, the Legend of Vox Machina, or when Smaug attacks Lake Town, right? And your party's like, okay, well, you guys are standing in this, the mouth of this alley, and you see the dragon fly by in the distance, and there's smoke, and there's people yelling, and he's knocking over buildings and towers, and bricks are flying everywhere. The sound of his roars are echoing all around the town. What do you do? Well, the ranger might be, well, I'm going to wait till I spot him and shoot him. Well, okay. You kind of step out of the alleyway a little bit. You have an arrow on the string, and you keep kind of spotting him through the smoke and fire and everything. You can't really get a good shot at him from here. You're going to have to maybe climb up to the top of the bell tower where you have a better field of view, or go out in the middle of the street and kind of stand there and try to catch sight of him and see if you can get a shot off at him. And then when they're okay, well, I'm going to climb up to the top of the tower. All right, so now I want you to make a instinct roll to try to spot him before he spots you at the top of this tower, right? Just like you would see on a screen where, the ranger is looking around, he's got his bow, and then suddenly out of the smoke behind him, the audience sees the dragon coming, right? Or even worse, if you're a melee character or something, you've got to try to charge up, and it's going to knock you back with its wings. Its tail is everywhere. There's debris. There's people running. You create basically extra moves that the players need to take to get into position to even hurt this thing. And because of the way these kind of games work, players are rolling those extra moves. That might put the spotlight back on you as the GM. That might get you a fear that you can then turn around to let the dragon take another move. So basically, you're increasing the difficulty not by just giving the monster more hit points or having it do more damage, but by making the narrative such that the party has to take extra moves to even get close to him. Let's give another example so I can show you kind of what I'm thinking about. Let's take this Minotaur, right? Let's say the party's back in that tavern, and the Minotaur's kind of going berserk, and he's knocking over tables, and patrons are flying everywhere, and a couple of people are trying to hold him back, and he's, throwing people off and charging across the room, and then you say, what do you guys do? And let's suppose the party wants to try to stop this guy, right? So if the party barbarian can just run up to him and try to grab him or attack him or knock the axe out of his hand, that's one thing. But if he describes trying to run up and grab him, and you say, well, to even get close to him, you're going to have to dodge all these tables that are flying everywhere and people's bodies trying to run past you and everything else. Give me a, agility roll, right? If they succeed on the agility roll, then they get close enough they can go ahead and take a swing at this guy. If they fail, the spotlight comes back to me, and maybe I get a fear out of it. The cool thing about this is you can create situations like the one I just described, where the ability roll they need to roll to get into position to fight the monster is not their main, it's not strength for the barbarian, right? He's got to use some agility to get over there. The thief that wants to, throw daggers, maybe he needs instinct to figure out how to weave through the crowd, okay? The secret is finding ways to add extra steps between the party and what they want to do, and then tell them the requirements and ask. So I'm going to try to leave a link, like I said, in the description to that forum post so you can see a little bit more about how this was done in the Dungeon World, and then see if you want to bring it into your game. Okay, last but definitely not least, in the book they do have GM principle: ask questions, use answers. But they don't go nearly as deep into it as people did in Dungeon World and Freebooters on the Frontiers. In those games, we had these things called dungeon starters. And it was just a little 2-page spread with a few things on it to kind of help you improvise at the table a adventure. Now, you may not want to take your improv to that level, but the questions that you ask your players, not just at the beginning of the campaign, but in any adventure that they are going into, can add so much richness to what happens, and it gets the players involved because they have more to say about it. So I'm going to be running the Treasure Vaults of Zadabad, and I'm going to be asking my players, okay, you had to double cross somebody to get this translation of this rune that you have at the beginning of the campaign. Who did you double cross, and how likely are they to come after you? Right? When they get to the island and they've spent a night in the little village there, I might be like, you've heard a rumor about the sounds of the crickets and birds in the jungle having some weird mental effect on people. What do you think it does? And do you believe it? Right? You hear the rumbles of the volcano in the distance. What prophecy do the locals believe will be unleashed when the volcano finally erupts? Those questions can be tough for some people, especially if they're used to 5e and they're used to being on the player side of the screen, and they're not quite ready for that. But if you can ease them into it, it can sure add a lot to your Daggerheart game. One thing they did in the Perilous Wilds, they started this idea, okay, the person who's reading the map to get them to the Treasure Vaults of Zadabad, just ask them, what's one of the landmarks that you see on the map, and what did the village elder tell you to be on the lookout for when you see it? Right? Just a simple little thing. It's not core to the adventure. You're not asking them about what's in the treasure vaults. Just what's a landmark, and what did he tell you was a danger that's associated with it, right? Or the guy who's scouting ahead, be like, you heard something about how to tell if the carnivorous apes of the forest are awake or not. What was the thing that the local village blacksmith told you to remember about the carnivorous apes of the forest? Once you start getting players into this sort of mindset, it can add a lot to your game. So anyway, those are just 5 things that you can start doing in your Daggerheart games, hopefully to level them up. If you like this content, give us a like, give us a subscribe, and join us next time on the Henchman's Memoirs.